When you stop being available, everything changes. Carl Jung on boundaries, individuation, and the self. If you enjoyed the content, please consider subscribing and liking the video. It truly helps the channel grow and continue to create contents like this. When you stop being available, everything changes. And the first thing that changes is the sound of your own life. I say sound because for years it can feel like you're living inside a room full of ringing phones, soft knocks at the door, little pings of expectation. You learn to answer before the second ring. You learn to smile before someone finishes the sentence. You learn, in Jung's language, to wear the persona so well that you forget you ever put it on. I remember a winter evening, the kind where the streetlights turn the snow into drifting gold. I was younger then, still quick to prove I could carry what other people dropped. My neighbor called upset about a family argument. My sister texted, needing help with a decision she'd already made. A coworker emailed, "Just one more thing." And I, like a faithful dog, ran toward every whistle. By midnight I sat in my kitchen with cold tea and the strange ache of having spent myself without ever arriving anywhere. I had been available to everyone, and unavailable to the one person who could not be replaced, the quiet witness inside me. Jung would have called that witness the self, not the ego that likes to feel useful, not the social mask that earns applause, but the deeper organizing center that whispers in symbols, dreams, and moods. The tragedy is that the self does not shout. It nudges. It turns down the brightness on the outer world until you finally notice the inner lamp flickering. When you ignore it long enough, it will send stronger messengers: fatigue, resentment, odd tears at the wrong commercials, a dream where you miss a train over and over, or where you're searching for a room in a house that somehow belongs to you. Stopping your availability is not a cruel act. It's an act of psychic hygiene. It's how you stop bleeding energy into the collective demands and begin to gather it back into your own vessel. In analytic psychology, this isn't selfishness. It's the beginning of individuation, the slow, brave process of becoming who you actually are, rather than who the world trained you to be. Because here's the part no one tells you: your constant availability is often an unconscious bargain. "I will be what you need," the bargain says, "and in return I will not have to face what I need." The bargain keeps you busy. Busy is a wonderful anesthetic. Busy keeps you from hearing the shadow clearing its throat behind you. The shadow is not a demon. It is simply everything you have pushed out of the light to remain lovable, safe, respectable. It might contain your anger, your longing, your hunger for solitude, your wish to be seen without performing. It might contain your capacity to say no. It might contain the suspicion that you've been living as a function instead of a person. So one day you stop answering on the first ring. Not with a dramatic announcement, not with a slammed door. You just pause. You breathe. You ask yourself, "Is this mine?" That question alone is a little revolution. At first, guilt rises like warm water. People who benefited from your open-door soul begin to rattle the handle. They may call you distant. They may say you've changed, as if change were a crime. But in Jungian terms, what's happening is that your old persona is losing its monopoly. The mask begins to loosen, and the face underneath begins to get air. And the world, sensing a shift, responds. Some people drift away, not because you became cold, but because you stopped playing the role that made them comfortable. Other relationships, the sturdier ones, adjust like trees in new wind. And then there are those strange moments when someone looks at you, really looks, and says, "You seem different. More yourself." It can be unsettling to hear, like discovering you've been speaking in a borrowed voice. This is where projections come in. Jung taught that much of what we think we love or hate in others is actually our own unconscious material thrown onto them like a film on a screen. When you are endlessly available, you become the perfect screen. People project, rescuer, onto you. Listener, the strong one, the reliable one. You accept the projection because it gives you an identity and spares you the risk of being ordinary, complicated, occasionally disappointing. But when you stop being available, the projection has nowhere to land. It slides off. People are forced to meet you as you are, and they don't always like the truth of that. The ego, meanwhile, panics. The ego wants stability, predictability, a clear job title in the tribe. It says, "If I'm not needed, am I safe?" This is an ancient fear. In the old village, being unnecessary could mean being left out in the cold. So the ego clings to usefulness like a coat. Yet the self asks for something else, not usefulness, but wholeness. Not constant giving, but right relationship. Right relationship begins with a boundary. And boundaries are not walls, they are doors with hinges. They can open and close. They let love in without letting you leak out. When you stop being available, you also begin to notice your dreams change. The psyche loves symbols. Sometimes you dream of locking a door and feeling relief. Sometimes you dream of missing calls and feeling strangely free. Sometimes you dream of a wild animal, fox, wolf, deer, watching you from the edge of the woods. That animal is often an image of instinct returning, a piece of life energy you've exiled to stay civilized. And then there is the deeper shift. You start to experience time differently. When you're always on call, time belongs to others. It is chopped into little servings you hand out like candy. But when you reclaim your availability, time becomes a landscape again. You can walk inside it. You can hear your own footsteps. You can sit in silence long enough for buried feelings to rise, not as emergencies, but as information. This is not comfortable. Individuation rarely is. When you stop being available, the inner world that you've been avoiding steps forward like a long-neglected guest. It brings suitcases. It wants to talk. It might even demand grief for years you spent trying to earn love through service. It might ask you to mourn the version of yourself that survived by pleasing. And mourning is holy work. I've watched people do this late in life, when the stakes are clearer. They come into the last chapters and realize they have been everyone's instrument, and no one's music. So they start small. They let a call go to voicemail. They take a walk without telling anyone. They say gently, "I can't today." And the world does not end. In fact, something else begins. Because the moment you stop being constantly available, you create a little space. And in that space, the psyche does what it has always wanted to do. It starts to integrate. The shadow, no longer exiled, offers you its gifts, honesty, limits, courage. The persona, no longer glued to your face, becomes what it was meant to be, a tool, not a prison. And the self, patient as winter snow, begins to show you images of the life that fits you. You may notice synchronicities, small meaningful coincidences, appearing like breadcrumbs. A book opens to a line that names your secret. A stranger says something that feels like a message. Jung didn't treat these as magical tricks. He saw them as signs that the inner and outer worlds can align when you stop scattering your energy. So yes, everything changes. Your friendships change. Your family dynamics change. Your sense of identity changes. But the biggest change is quiet and profound. You stop living as an emergency service and start living as a soul. And if you're listening right now and you're afraid to pull back, I understand. It can feel like stepping out of a spotlight and into a dark hallway. But that hallway leads to rooms you haven't explored. It leads to the parts of you that are not performative, not convenient, not polished. It leads to the gold Jung spoke of, the hidden treasure inside the psyche that appears when you commit to becoming whole. Availability can be a complex at work. Jung used complex for a knot in the psyche, an emotional constellation formed around early love and fear. Many of us carry a good child complex. Affection felt conditional, so we learn to earn it by anticipating needs. The trouble is, a complex is hungry. It doesn't say, "Thank you, that's enough." It keeps asking for proof. When you stop being available, that old knot tightens first. It throws thoughts at you, you're abandoning them. You're turning cold. You'll be alone. Those aren't prophecies. They're old feelings hunting for a present-day reason. A simple practice is to name the voice. That's the frightened child. Or, that's the rescuer. Naming creates distance. Distance creates choice. I began with one evening a week that belonged to nobody but my inner world. I'd sit with a notebook, not to plan, but to listen. Jung called this active imagination, letting images speak so the unconscious doesn't have to shout through symptoms. I would ask the obligated part of me, "What do you need?" The answers were small and honest: rest, respect, a life that didn't require constant apology for taking up space. In the next part, I want to talk about the moment people push back, when your no triggers their anger, and how to meet that anger without collapsing back into old patterns, because that is often the threshold where the real transformation begins. Quiet courage today. That threshold can feel like standing at the edge of a frozen lake, testing whether the ice will hold. You say no, and someone's face tightens. You don't answer immediately, and a familiar accusation arrives. "You've been ignoring me." The old version of you would rush to explain, to soothe, to overcompensate with extra availability as proof of love. But Jung would invite you to notice what gets activated inside you in that moment, because the outer conflict is often a spotlight on an inner one. When people push back, they're not only reacting to your boundary, they're reacting to the collapse of a story. If you have long played the role of caretaker, mediator, problem solver, your no is experienced as a violation of the shared myth. And myths are powerful. They don't like being rewritten. Inside you, a different myth stirs, the fear of being the bad one. This is where the shadow returns with a very specific gift: appropriate aggression. That phrase sounds harsh, but it's actually a form of clean energy. It's the part of you that can protect your time, your body, your attention, without cruelty. Many of us were taught that any aggression is dangerous, so we banish it. Then it returns distorted as passive resentment, sharp sarcasm, or sudden explosions that scare even us. Integrating aggression doesn't mean becoming mean. It means becoming real. So imagine this: someone is angry because you didn't drop everything. The old complex begs you to repair. The integrated self says, "I can tolerate their disappointment." That sentence is a spiritual weightlifting set. Disappointment, yours, theirs, everyone's, is not a catastrophe. It's part of adulthood. And adulthood, in Jung's view, is not an age, it's a relationship to your own psyche. One of the clearest signs you're individuating is that you can stand in the tension of opposites without immediately collapsing to one side. You can care about someone and still say no. You can love your family and still not be on call. You can be generous and still be boundaried. The ego prefers simple identities. "I'm the helpful one," or "I'm the independent one." The self prefers paradox. "I am both and more." Now, when the pushback comes, it often arrives in archetypal clothing. A parent might speak with the voice of the tyrant. "After all I've done, you owe me." A friend might slip into the orphan. "Nobody ever shows up for me." A partner might become the seducer. "If you loved me, you'd prove it." These aren't labels to weaponize, they're patterns to recognize. Archetypes are like old costumes in the human closet. We all try them on, especially when we're scared. Your task is not to defeat the other person. Your task is to remain in contact with your own center while you respond. That's the difference between a boundary and a battle. A boundary is clear, calm, and repeatable. A battle is a reenactment of childhood, with adult vocabulary. Here is something I learned the slow way: explanations are often a way of surrendering. When you over-explain, you hand your boundary to someone else for approval. Of course, a little context can be kind. But there's a point where context turns into pleading. Jung would say the complex is talking then, not you. The complex believes that if it can just find the perfect sentence, it will be granted permission to exist. But permission is not the goal. Wholeness is. So you practice a new language. Shorter. Simpler. "I can't make it tonight. I'm not able to take that on. I'll respond tomorrow." And then you sit with what arises in you afterward. Maybe you feel guilty. Maybe you feel relief so big it scares you. Maybe you feel grief. Let those feelings be data, not directives. The psyche is reorganizing itself. Of course, it feels strange. Sometimes the pushback comes not as anger but as seduction. People suddenly become sweeter, more flattering, even desperate. That can be just as tricky. Jung warned about inflation, when the ego swells with a new identity. If you stop being available and everyone panics, you might secretly enjoy the power of being missed. That's the trickster lurking, nudging you to swing from martyr to monarch. Individuation is not about becoming untouchable. It's about becoming conscious. A boundary without heart becomes a wall. Heart without boundary becomes a leak. The middle path is what I call a hinge door. It opens on purpose, it closes on purpose, and it doesn't apologize for being a door. And here's another Jungian layer. When you stop being available, your inner masculine and feminine energies, what Jung called animus and anima, begin to renegotiate their roles. In many people, the animus shows up as a harsh inner voice that demands productivity and competence. Be useful or be nothing. The anima can show up as a longing for connection that fears abandonment. If I'm not needed, I'll be left. These are not strictly about gender, they're symbolic forces. When you reclaim your time, these forces often clash. One part says, hold the line. Another part says, go back, fix it. If you've ever felt torn between being strong and being loved, you've felt this inner drama. The work is to bring them into dialogue. Strength can be tender. Love can be firm. When they cooperate, you become steadier. You stop swinging between overgiving and isolation. You begin to choose. Now, what happens to your relationships? They become more honest, and honesty can feel like weather. Some days it's clear. Some days it storms. The relationships that depended on your self-abandonment may fade. That can hurt, even if it's right. Grief is not a sign you made the wrong choice. Grief is the price of growing a new life. But other relationships deepen. When you're no longer constantly available, your yes becomes meaningful. People can feel the difference. Your presence stops being automatic and becomes intentional. A friend hears your yes and thinks, they're really here. That kind of presence is rare, and it nourishes both sides. You may also discover a quiet loneliness at first, not because you're unloved, but because you're no longer plugged into the constant current of other people's needs. That loneliness is a doorway. Jung would not rush to fill it. He would ask what it wants to show you. Often it reveals a neglected part of your inner life: creativity, prayer, play, contemplation. The psyche, when given space, naturally moves toward balance. In later life, this matters even more. I've sat with people in their 80s who finally stopped being available to old dramas. They didn't become bitter, they became spacious. They could listen without absorbing. They could love without being dragged. And in that spaciousness, something luminous appeared, a sense that their life belonged to them again. So if you're practicing this now, take it slowly. Expect the old complexes to protest. Expect some people to test you, the way a child tests a fence to see if it's real. Be gentle and consistent. Consistency is compassion in action. And when you slip, because you will, don't punish yourself. Notice what pulled you back. Was it fear of conflict? Fear of abandonment? Fear of not being special? Every slip is information, and information is how the psyche learns. One last image, before we close. Imagine a well. When you are endlessly available, you keep lowering the bucket even when the well is nearly dry. You do it out of habit, out of love, out of fear. When you stop being available, you put the bucket down. You let the well refill. You guard it, not with bitterness but with reverence. And eventually, when you offer water again, it is clean. It is chosen. It is yours to give. That's when everything changes, not only around you, but within you, because you're no longer living from the mask alone. You're living from the center. If you want something practical, a small ritual can help. Before you answer a request, place a hand on your chest and ask, what am I feeling right now? Then ask, what will it cost me to say yes? Jung cared about energy, where it flowed and where it got trapped. Your body is often the first honest oracle. Tight throat, clenched jaw, sudden heaviness, signals that the ego is signing the old bargain again. Dreams can guide you too. After you set a boundary, pay attention at night. You might dream of an overloaded suitcase, a house with too many guests, a phone that won't stop ringing. Sometimes you dream of a garden behind a gate. Those images are the psyche's commentary. Write them down. Ask, what part of me is this? In time, the dreams often shift. The guests leave. The garden opens. Some people will accuse you of changing because your change highlights their own avoidance. Your boundary becomes a mirror. It shows them how much they've relied on you instead of developing their own strength. That can provoke shame, and shame often disguises itself as anger. Remembering this keeps you from taking their reaction as proof you are wrong. In Jung's terms, you're withdrawing projections not only from others, but from yourself. You stop projecting your value onto their approval. You begin to locate value where it belongs, in your own relationship with the self. And when that relationship strengthens, something quiet happens. You can be kind without being captured, helpful without disappearing. The inner world stops feeling like a neglected basement and starts feeling like home, familiar, alive, worth returning to. Every dawn.